Good morning, everybody. I'm Craig, and this is Marauder's Mike. This morning I'm reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Chapter 12, The Triwizard Tournament. I do slow, trauma informed readings of fiction, pausing to notice what's happening under the surface fear, attachment, defenses, and meaning. This isn't recap or fandom theory. I'm interested in why certain stories stay with us and what they can tell us about being human and how we can make meaning after chaos. I engage with comments as we go, and we'll leave a little space at the end for conversation. Some of this material can be confronting, so take it at whatever pace works for you. Let's begin. Chapter 12 The Triwizard Tourney. And good morning. Hi, Katie. Welcome back. And thanks everybody else for joining me. Through the gates, flanked with the statues of winged boars and up the sweeping drive, the carriages trundled, swaying dangerously in what was fast becoming a gale. Leaning against the window, Harry could see Hogwarts coming nearer, its many lighted windows blurred and shimmering behind the thick curtains of rain. Lightning flashed across the sky as their carriage came to a halt before the great oak front doors, which stood at the top of a flight of stone steps. People who had occupied the carriages in front were already hurrying up the stone steps into the castle. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville jumped down from their carriage and dashed up the steps too, looking up only when they were safely inside the cavernous, torch-lit entrance hall with its magnificent marble staircase. "Blimey," said Ron, shaking his head and sending water everywhere. "If that keeps up, the lake's going to overflow. I'm Arg!" A large, red, water-filled balloon had dropped from out of the ceiling onto Ron's head and exploded. Drenched and spluttering, Ron staggered sideways into Harry just as a second water bomb dropped, narrowly missing Hermione. It burst at Harry's feet, sending a wave of cold water over his trainers and into his socks. How would you be feeling right now if you were one of the three? People all around them shrieked and started pushing each other in their efforts to get out of the line of fire. Harry looked up and saw, floating 20 feet above them, Peeves the poltergeist, a little man in a bell-covered hat, an orange bow tie, his wide, malicious face contorted with concentration as he took aim again. "Peeves!" yelled an angry voice. "Peeves! Come down here at once!" Professor McGonagall, deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor House, had come dashing out of the Great Hall. She skidded on the wet floor and grabbed Hermione around the neck to stop her falling. "Ouch! Sorry, Miss Granger." "That's all right, Professor," Hermione gasped, massaging her throat. "Peeves, get down here now," barked Professor McGonagall, straightening her pointed hat and glaring upwards through her square-rimmed spectacles. "Not doing nothing," cackled Peeves, lobbing a water bomb at several fifth-year girls who screamed and dived into the Great Hall. "Already wet, aren't they? Little squirts. Whee!" And he aimed another bomb at a group of second-years who had just arrived. "I shall call the headmaster," shouted Professor McGonagall. "I'm warning you, Peeves." Peeves stuck out his tongue, threw the last of his water bombs into the air, and zoomed off up the marble staircase, cackling insanely. "Well, move along then," said Professor McGonagall sharply to the bedraggled crowd. "Into the Great Hall. Come on." Well, that's not a great start for the school year, is it? In the entryway itself, we have chaos. McGonagall shows up and she restores order, which is great, but where's the empathy for the kids? That just happened. Okay, move along, get into the hall. Harry, Ron, and Hermione slipped and slid across the entrance hall and through the double doors on the right. Ron muttering furiously under his breath as he pushed his sopping hair off his face, because Ron is the angry one. The great hall looked its usual splendid self, decorated for the start of term feast. Golden plates and goblets gleamed by the light of hundreds and thousands. Oh, I'm sorry. Golden plates and goblets gleamed by the light of hundreds and hundreds of candles, floating over the tables in midair. The 4 long house tables were packed with chattering students. At the top of the hall, the staff sat along one side of the 5th table, facing their pupils. It was much warmer in here. Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked past the Slytherins, the Ravenclaws, and the Hufflepuffs, and sat down with the rest of the Gryffindors at the far side of the hall, next to nearly headless Nick, the Gryffindor ghost. Pearly white and semi-transparent, Nick was dressed tonight in his usual doublet, with a particularly large ruff, which served the dual purpose of looking extra festive and ensuring that his head didn't wobble too much on his partially severed neck. "Good evening," he said, beaming at them. "Says who?" said Harry, taking off his trainers and emptying them of water. "Hope they hurry up with the sorting. I'm starving." The sorting of the new students into houses took place at the start of every school year, but by an unlucky combination of circumstances, Harry hadn't been present at one since his own. He was quite looking forward to it. Just then, a highly excited, breathless voice called down the table, "Hiya, Harry." It was Colin Creevey, a 3rd year, to whom Harry was something of a hero. "Hi, Colin," said Harry, warily. "Harry, guess what? Guess what, Harry? My brother's starting. My brother Dennis." Good," said Harry. "He's really excited," said Colin, practically bouncing up and down in his seat. "I just hope he's in Gryffindor. Keep your fingers crossed, eh, Harry?" Yeah, all right," said Harry. He turned back to Hermione, Ron, and nearly headless Nick. "Brothers and sisters usually go in the same houses, don't they?" he said. He was judging by the Weasleys, all 7 of whom had been put into Gryffindor. "Oh, no, not necessarily," said Hermione. "Parvati Patil's twins and Ravenclaw, and they're identical. You'd think they'd be together, wouldn't you?" Harry looked up at the staff table. There seemed to be rather more empty seats there than usual. Hagrid, of course, was still fighting his way across the lake with the first years. Professor McGonagall was presumably supervising the drying of the entrance hall floor, but there was another empty chair too, and he couldn't think of who else was missing. All right, let's look at some comments here. Putting a couple up on the board. Katie says, "Soggy socks is a horrible feeling. I'd probably be shivering the rest of the day in that situation." Wet clothing is awful, particularly if you're wearing cotton and you weren't prepared for it. Not doing. I don't think Peeves is an English major, but I see what you're saying there. Yeah. Why don't they have a drying spell? If you have a reparo spell, why don't you? Now let's show some more. Colin is something. I'm not going to make any judgments about Colin just yet. Maybe dude's just needy and insecure. I'm not sure. But I'm watching Colin, and I'd like to finalize an opinion when we get to the end. And Beck says, Harry's thinking they're right. He doesn't want to deal with double that energy. Although maybe the brother's a little less intense, easier to deal with. Maybe the brother would be an asset. I don't know. "Where's the new defense against the dark arts teacher?" said Hermione, who was also looking up at the teachers. They had never yet had a defense against the dark arts teacher who had lasted more than 3 terms. Harry's favorite by far had been Professor Lupin, who had resigned last year. He looked up and down the staff table. There was definitely no new face there. "Maybe they couldn't get anyone," said Hermione, looking anxious. Harry scanned the table more carefully. Tiny little Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, was sitting on a large pile of cushions beside Professor Sprout, the herbology teacher, whose hat was askew over her flyaway gray hair. She was talking to Professor Sinistra of the astronomy department. On Professor Sinistra's other side was the sallow-faced, hook-nosed, greasy-haired potions master, Snape. Harry's least favorite person at Hogwarts. That would include Malfoy. Harry's loathing of Snape was matched only by Snape's hatred of him, a hatred which had, if possible, intensified last year when Harry had helped Sirius escape right under Snape's overlarge nose. Snape and Sirius had been enemies since their own school days. Some of that is true. Some of that, for those that have finished the series, we know is actually a little projecty on Harry's part. On Snape's other side was an empty seat, which Harry guessed was Professor McGonagall's. Next to it, and in the very center of the table, sat Professor McGonagall, the headmaster, his sweeping silver hair and beard shining in the candlelight, his magnificent deep green robes embroidered with many stars and moons. The tips of Dumbledore's long, thin fingers were together, and he was resting his chin upon them, staring up at the ceiling through his half-moon spectacles as though lost in thought. Harry glanced up at the ceiling, too. It was enchanted to look like the sky outside, and he had never seen it look this stormy. Black and purple clouds were swirling across it, and as another thunderclap sounded outside, a fork of lightning flashed across it. "Oh, hurry up," Ron moaned beside Harry. "I could eat a hippogriff." The words were no sooner out of his mouth than the doors of the great hall opened, and silence fell. Professor McGonagall was leading a long line of first years up to the top of the hall. If Harry, Ron, and Hermione were wet, it was nothing to how these first years looked. They appeared to have swum across the lake rather than sailing. All of them were shivering with a combination of cold and nerves as they filed along the staff table and came to a halt in a line facing the rest of the school. All of them, except for the smallest of the lot, a boy with mousy hair, who is wrapped in what Harry recognized as Hagrid's moleskin coat. The coat was so big for him that it looked as though he was draped in a furry black marquee. His small face protruded from over the collar, looking almost painfully excited. When he had lined up with his terrified-looking peers, he caught Colin Creevy's eye, gave a double thumbs up, and mouthed, "I fell in the lake." He looked positively delighted about it. Professor McGonagall now placed a three-legged stool on the ground before the first years, and, on top of it, an extremely old, dirty, patched wizard's hat. The first years stared at it. So did everyone else. For a moment, there was silence. Then a tear near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat broke into song. All right, that's the problem with the first read. I hadn't seen this before. I'm going to need a sip of water before I get into this silliness. Let's go to comments, and then we'll talk about the scene we just saw. All right, a giant spell. Maybe she took care of it when she went back, and she just wanted the kids out of the way first. I mean, that's valid. All right, and here's somebody who knows the series telling me one Creevy is enough. Heard. Yeah, that was nice, wasn't it? Under Snape's overlarge. She really slides those subtle digs in there. And the hat broke into song. 1,000 years or more ago, when I was newly sown, there lived 4 wizards of renown, whose names are still well known. Bold Gryffindor from Wild Moor, fair Ravenclaw from Glen, sweet Hufflepuff from Valley Broad, shrewd Slytherin from Fen. They shared a wish, a hope, a dream. They hatched a daring plan to educate young sorcerers. Thus Hogwarts School began. Now each of these 4 founders formed their own house for each, did value different virtues in the ones they had to teach. By Gryffindor, the bravest were, prized far beyond the rest. For Ravenclaw, the cleverest, would always be the best. For Hufflepuff, hard workers were, most worthy of admission. And power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. While still alive, they did divide their favorites from the throng. Yet how to pick the worthy ones when they were dead and gone? 'Twas Gryffindor who found the way, he whipped me off his head. The founders put some brains in me, so I could choose instead. Now slip me a snug about your ears, I've never yet been wrong. I'll have a look inside your head and tell you where you belong. The great hall rang with applause as the Sorting Hat finished. That's not the song it sang when it sorted us, said Harry, clapping along with everyone else. Sings a different one every year, said Ron. It's got to be a pretty boring life, hasn't it? Being a hat. I suppose it spends all year making up the next one. Professor McGonagall was now unrolling a large scroll of parchment. When I call out your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool, she told the first years. When the hat announces your house, you will go and sit with the appropriate table. Curly, Stuart. A boy walked forward, visibly trembling, from head to foot, picking up the sorting hat, putting it on, and sat down on the stool. Ravenclaw, shouted the hat. Stuart Ackerley took the hat off and hurried into a seat at the Ravenclaw table, where everyone was applauding him. Harry caught a glimpse of Cho, the Ravenclaw seeker, cheering Stuart Ackerley as he sat down. For a fleeting second, Harry had a strange desire to join the Ravenclaw table too. Baddock, Malcolm, Slytherin. The tape on the other side of the hall erupted with cheers. Harry could see Malfoy clapping as Baddock joined the Slytherins. Harry wondered whether Baddock knew that Slytherin House had turned out more dark witches and wizards than any other. Fred and George kissed Malcolm Baddock as he sat down. They always bring up that Slytherin turns out more than the others, but the others still turn them out. Hufflepuff has turned out dark wizards, apparently. So Slytherin's not evil, they're just slightly more evil than average, it could be argued. Branstone, Eleanor, Hufflepuff. Caldwell, Owen, Hufflepuff. Creevy, Dennis. Tiny Dennis Creevy staggered forward, tripping over Hagrid's moleskin just as Hagrid himself sidled into the hall through a door behind the teacher's table. About twice as tall as a normal man and at least 3 times as broad, Hagrid, with his long, wild, tangled black hair and beard, looked slightly alarming. A misleading impression, for Harry, Ron, and Hermione knew Hagrid to possess a very kind nature. He winked at them as he sat down at the end of the staff table and watched Dennis Creevy putting on the sorting hat. The riff at the brim opened wide. Gryffindor, the hat shouted. Hagrid clapped along with the Gryffindors as Dennis Creevy, beaming widely, took off the hat, placed it back on the stool, and hurried over to join his brother. Colin, I fell in, he said shrilly, throwing himself into an empty seat. It was brilliant, and something in the water grabbed me and pushed me back in the boat. Cool, said Colin, just as excitedly. It was probably the giant squid, Dennis. Wow, said Dennis, as though nobody in their wildest dreams could hope for more than being thrown into a storm-tossed, fathoms-deep lake and pushed out of it again by a giant sea monster. All right, I'm starting to figure out the Creevies, actually. 2 of them is useful. Dennis, see that boy down there? The one with the black hair and glasses? See him? Know who he is, Dennis? Harry looked away, staring very hard at the sorting hat, now sorting Emma Dobbs. The sorting continued. Boys and girls with varying degrees of fright on their faces moving one by one to the 3-legged stool, the line dwindling slowly as Professor McGonagall passed the L's. Oh, hurry up, Ron moaned, massaging his stomach. Now, Ron, the sorting's much more important than food, said nearly headless Nick, as madly Laura became a Hufflepuff. Of course it is, if you're dead, snapped Ron. I do hope this year's batch of Gryffindors are up to the scratch, said nearly headless Nick, applauding as MacDonald, Natalie, joined the Gryffindor table. We don't want to break our winning streak, do we? Gryffindor had won the inter-house championship for the last 3 years in a row. Pritchard, Graham, Slytherin. Quirk, Orla, Ravenclaw. And finally, with Whitby, Kevin, Hufflepuff. The sorting ended. Professor McGonagall picked up the hat and the stool and carried them away. About time, said Ron, seizing his knife and fork and looking expectantly at his golden plate. Professor Dumbledore had got to his feet. He was smiling around at the students, his arms opened wide and welcome. And now we're going to talk about the sorting ceremony. If we look at how this sorting ceremony is constructed, where the initiates come in separately and everybody that's already established, second years up and all the staff is already there. This isn't actually constructed like a sorting. This is constructed like a rites of passage or a ceremonial initiation into a group. Because not knowing the nature of the ritual, they are brought before the tribe and they are made to be watched in an exposed and vulnerable situation as they are judged and observed by their peers and their mentors. This is a coming of age initiation ritual. It's disguised as a sorting. So we'll do messages and we'll get back to the text. I think it's the fact that Slytherins have the kind of values that are more likely to turn out bad wizards. The other houses still have done so, says Katie. I would agree. They probably just have the personality traits that make people more susceptible to following the path of dark magic. And what does Katie say? Dennis is the most Gryffindor a person can be. I look forward to developing my own opinion on that because that sounds interesting. Professor Dumbledore had got to his feet. He was smiling around at the students, his arms open wide in welcome. I have only 2 words to say to you, he told them, his deep voice echoing around the hall. Tuck in. Hear, hear, said Harry and Ron loudly as the empty dishes filled magically before their eyes. Nearly headless Nick watched mournfully as Harry, Ron, and Hermione loaded their plates. There's River, said Ron, with his mouth full of mashed potato. You're lucky there's a feast at all tonight, you know, said nearly headless Nick. There was trouble in the kitchens earlier. What? What happened? Said Harry, through a sizable chunk of steak. Peeves, of course, said nearly headless Nick, shaking his head, which wobbled dangerously. He pulled his ruff a little higher up his neck. The usual argument, you know. He wanted to attend the feast. Well, it's quite out of the question. You know what he's like. Utterly uncivilized. Can't see a plate of food without throwing it. We held a ghosts' council. The fat friar was all for giving him the chance. But most wisely, in my opinion, the Bloody Baron put his foot down. The Bloody Baron was the Slytherin ghost, a gaunt and silent specter covered in silver bloodstains. He was the only person at Hogwarts who could really control Peeves. Yeah, we thought Peeves seemed hacked off about something, said Ron darkly. So what did he do in the kitchens? Oh, the usual, said nearly headless Nick, shrugging. Wreaked havoc and mayhem. Pots and pans everywhere, place swimming in soup. Terrified the house elves out of their wits. Clang. Hermione had knocked over her golden goblet. What about the preceding sentence might have caught Hermione's attention, do we think? Pumpkin juice spread steadily over the tablecloth, staining several feet of white linen orange, but Hermione paid no attention. There are house elves here? She said, staring horror-struck at nearly headless Nick. Here at Hogwarts? Certainly, said nearly headless Nick, looking surprised at her reaction. The largest number in any dwelling in Britain, I believe. Over 100. I've never seen one, said Hermione. Well, they hardly ever leave the kitchen by day, do they? said Nearly Headless Nick. They come out at night to do a bit of cleaning, see to the fires and so on. I mean, you're not supposed to see them, are you? That's the mark of a good house elf, isn't it? That you don't know it's there? Hermione stared at him. But they get paid, she said. They get holidays, don't they? And sick leave and pensions and everything? Nearly Headless Nick chortled so much that his ruff slipped and his head flopped off, dangling on the inch or so of ghostly skin and muscle that still attached it to his neck. Sick leave and pensions, he said, pushing his head back onto his shoulders and securing it once more with his ruff. House elves don't want sick leave and pensions. Hermione looked down at her hardly touched plate of food, then put her knife and fork down upon it and pushed it away from her. Oh, come on, Hermione, said Ron, accidentally spraying Harry with bits of Yorkshire pudding. Oops, sorry. He swallowed. You won't get them sick leave by starving yourself. Slave labor, said Hermione, breathing hard through her nose. That's what made this dinner slave labor. And she refused to eat another bite. The rain was still drumming heavily against the high, dark windows. Another clap of thunder shook the windows, and the stormy ceiling flashed, illuminating the golden plates as the remains of the first course vanished and were replaced instantly with puddings. Treacle tart, Hermione, said Ron, deliberately wafting the smell towards her. Spotted Dick, look, chocolate gâteau. But Hermione gave him a look so reminiscent of Professor McGonagall that he gave up. When the puddings, too, had been demolished and the last crumbs had faded off the plates, leaving them sparkling clean, Albus Dumbledore got to his feet again. The buzz of chatter filling the hall ceased almost at once, so that only the howling wind and pounding rain could be heard. And before we start with Dumbledore's announcement, let's look at what just happened. We already know from the first 11 chapters that Hermione and house elves are an issue that's being explored so far in this book. Being aware of the oppression of and the enslavement of the house elves, Hermione has just realized that while they are going through this ritual of sorting people into houses, which looks like there are higher people and lower people in the ceremony, the entire thing in that very moment is being supported by an invisible, oppressed underclass. So you have this scene of privilege playing out, and she just discovered it's all supported by oppression of a sort. So from a social work perspective, that's certainly interesting. Let's go back to comments. Yes, but that's the thing with the ghosts, isn't it? They're the ones that have been afraid to move on. They have the ability to do so, but they choose not. They get stuck. Of course, they're incapable of change. They're not alive. They're just recordings, loops and echoes. And then from Becca, yeah, I haven't put a whole lot of thought into how that works in this world, but I think there's something there worth exploring. If we say that ghosts are something like people that are stuck with unresolved issues, and that's why they're stuck, and dementors are something akin to panic attacks or depression, then the poltergeists I'm not really pinning to something yet, but we'll work on that. And then, Katie answers the question. Ghosts are spirits of witches and wizards. Poltergeists were never human. Peeves is the manifestation of the chaotic energy of the students. Very well. Let's get back to the text. So, said Dumbledore, smiling around at them all. Now that we are all fed and watered, said Hermione, I must once more ask for your attention while I give out a few notices. Mr. Filch, the caretaker, has asked me to tell you that the list of objects forbidden inside the castle has this year been extended to include screaming yo-yos, fanged frisbees, and ever-bashing boomerangs. The full list comprises some 437 items, I believe, and can be viewed in Mr. Filch's office if anybody would like to check it. The corners of Dumbledore's mouth twitched. The reason it's in Filch's office is instead of being posted is because nobody else in the administration cares. So that's Filch's pet peeve, and nobody else really cares. He continued, "As ever, I would like to remind you all that the forest in the grounds is out of bounds to students, as is the village of Hogsmeade, to all below third year. It is also my painful duty to inform you that the Inter-House Quidditch Cup will not take place this year." "What?" Harry gasped. He looked around at Fred and George, his fellow members of the Quidditch team. They were mouthing soundlessly at Dumbledore, apparently too appalled to speak. Dumbledore continued, "This is due to an event that will be starting in October and continuing throughout the school year, taking up much of teachers' time and energy. But I'm sure you will all enjoy it immensely. I have great pleasure in announcing that this year at Hogwarts—" But at that moment, there was a deafening rumble of thunder, and the doors of the Great Hall banged open. A man stood in the doorway, leaning upon a long staff, shrouded in a black traveling cloak. Every head in the Great Hall swiveled towards the stranger, suddenly brightly illuminated by a fork of lightning that flashed across the ceiling. He lowered his hood, shook out a long mane of grizzled, dark gray hair, then began to walk up towards the teacher's table. What an amazing entry! Okay, what an amazing entry. I just watched Big Trouble in Little China the other night with my fiance. And if you look at it, is sort of structured, that movie, much like a classic cowboy film, where the sort of scrubby lone wanderer blows in from out of town. They have a whole adventure, and then the cowboy rides off. We've got the cowboy entrance. This is a cowboy movie of a sorts. A dull clunk echoed through the hall on his every other step. He reached the end of the top table, turned right, and limped heavily towards Dumbledore. Another flash of lightning crossed the ceiling. Hermione gasped. The lightning had thrown the man's face into sharp relief, and it was a face unlike any Harry had ever seen. It looked as though it had been carved out of weathered wood by someone who had only the vaguest idea of what human faces were supposed to look like, and was none too skilled with a chisel. Every inch of skin seemed to be scarred. The mouth looked like a diagonal gash, and a large chunk of the nose was missing. But it was the man's eyes that made him frightening. One of them was small, dark, and beady. The other was large, round as a coin, and a vivid electric blue. The blue eye was moving ceaselessly, without blinking, and was rolling up, down, and from side to side, quite independently of the normal eye. And then it rolled right over, pointing into the back of the man's head, so all they could see was whiteness. The stranger reached Dumbledore. He stretched out a hand that was as badly scarred as his face, and Dumbledore shook it, muttering words Harry couldn't hear. He seemed to be making some inquiry of the stranger, who shook his head unsmilingly and replied in an undertone. Dumbledore nodded and gestured the man to the empty seat on his right-hand side. The stranger sat down, shook his mane of dark gray hair out of his face, pulled a plate of sausages toward him, raised it to what was left of his nose, and sniffed it. He then took a small knife out of his pocket, speared a sausage on the end of it, and began to eat. His normal eye was fixed upon the sausages, but the blue eye was still darting restlessly around in its socket, taking in the hall and the students. That was a lot of description. For those of you who see things like images in your head, if you actually try to construct an image with that description, you can also imagine of 100 people, students, whatever the actual student body is, hundreds of students silently all staring at this man with the same sort of attention. Imagine 500 kids just staring at you, and you're just like, that makes an impression. May I introduce our new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, said Dumbledore brightly into the silence. Professor Moody. It was usual for new staff members to be greeted with applause, but none of the staff or students clapped except Dumbledore and Hagrid. Both put their hands together and applauded, but the sound echoed dismally into the silence and they stopped fairly quickly. Everyone else seemed too transfixed by Moody's bizarre appearance to do more than stare at him. See, Moody is already the outsider. He is definitely the distrusted and scary stranger rolling in from out of town, which means if it follows the format of such things, he doesn't get to stay. I mean, obviously, the dad teacher never gets to stay, but he certainly doesn't. Moody, Harry muttered to Ron. Mad-Eye Moody? The one your dad went to help this morning? Must be, said Ron in a low, odd voice. What happened to him? Hermione whispered. What happened to his face? Don't know, Ron whispered back, watching Moody with fascination. Moody seemed totally indifferent to his less than warm welcome. Ignoring the jug of pumpkin juice in front of him, he reached again into his traveling cloak, pulled out a hip flask, and took a long draught from it. As he lifted his arm to drink, his cloak was pulled a few inches from the ground, and Harry saw, below the table, several inches of a carved wooden leg ending in a clawed foot. Dumbledore cleared his throat again. As I was saying, he said, smiling at the sea of students before him, all of whom were still gazing transfixed at Mad-Eye Moody, we are to have the honor of hosting a very exciting event over the coming months, an event which has not been held for over a century. It is my very great pleasure to inform you that the Triwizard tournament will be taking place at Hogwarts this year. You're joking, said Fred Weasley loudly. The tension that had filled the hall ever since Moody's arrival suddenly broke. Nicely timed. Nearly everyone laughed, and Dumbledore chuckled appreciatively. Well timed in the sequence of that announcement. Imagine how the vibe would go if we had reversed the order, announced the tournament, and then Moody's entrance. Also wonder if the way that Moody entered was a deliberate staging by Dumbledore or just incidental. Let's go into our comments. Yes, well, I mean, Wood was very clear in his motivations. He wanted that win. Yeah, excellent point, Kitty. Mad-Eye does sound terrifying to look at, but maybe it's just fascinating because I know if, in the real world, if I saw somebody with an eyeball doing that, I'd be staring too, just because trying to understand, trying to make it make sense. I mean, apparently they were staring at the guy's eyes so hard they didn't even notice the peg leg with the claw foot while he's walking in. They were staring right at the man. I want to see how they make him show up because I like the movies, but this sounds pretty much more intimidating. And, well, the twins are usually pretty good at that. Normally they work together, but yeah. It works that it was either Fred or George. Is there a specific reason that you're calling out Fred? Could it not have been George? I don't know. You're joking, said Fred Weasley loudly. The tension that had filled the hall ever since Moody's arrival suddenly broke. Nearly everyone laughed, and Dumbledore chuckled appreciatively. I am not joking, Mr. Weasley, he said. Though, now you mention it, I did hear an excellent one over the summer about a troll, a hag, and a leprechaun who all go to a bar. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat loudly. But maybe this is not the time, no? And Dumbledore said, Where was I? Ah, yes, the Triwizard Tournament. Well, some of you will not know what this tournament involves, so I hope those who do know will forgive me for giving a short explanation and allow their attention to wander freely. The Triwizard Tournament was first established some 700 years ago as a friendly competition between the three largest European schools of wizardry: Hogwarts, Beauxbatons, and Durmstrang. A champion was selected to represent each school, and the three champions competed in three magical tasks. The schools took it in turns to host the tournament once every 5 years, and it was generally agreed to be a most excellent way of establishing ties between young witches and wizards of different nationalities. Until, that is, the death toll mounted so high that the tournament was discontinued. Death toll, Hermione whispered, looking alarmed. But her anxiety did not seem to be shared by the majority of the students in the hall. Pay attention to that. Many of them were whispering excitedly with each other, and Harry himself was far more interested in hearing more about the tournament than in worrying about the deaths that had happened hundreds of years ago. There have been several attempts over the centuries to reinstate the tournament, Dumbledore continued, none of which have been very successful. However, our own departments of international magical cooperation and magical games and sports have decided the time is ripe for another attempt. We have worked hard over the summer to ensure that this time no champion will find himself or herself in mortal danger. The heads of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang will be arriving with their short-listed contenders in October, and the selection of the three champions will take place at Halloween. An impartial judge will decide which students are most worthy to compete for the Triwizard Cup, the glory of their school, and 1,000 galleons personal prize money. I'm going for it, Fred Weasley hissed down at the table, his face lit with enthusiasm at the prospect of such glory and riches. He was not the only person who seemed to be visualizing himself as Hogwarts champion. At every house table, Harry could see people either gazing raptly at Dumbledore or else whispering fervently to their neighbors. But then Dumbledore spoke again, and the hall quieted once more. Eager though I know all of you will be to bring the Triwizard Cup to Hogwarts, he said, the heads of the participating schools, along with the Ministry of Magic, have agreed to impose an age restriction on contenders this year. Only students who are of age, that is to say, 17 years or older, will be allowed to put forward their names for consideration. This, Dumbledore raised his voice slightly, for several people had made noises of outrage at these words, and the Weasley twins were suddenly looking furious, is a measure we feel is necessary. Given that the tournament tasks will still be difficult and dangerous, whatever precautions we take, and it is highly unlikely that students below 6th and 7th year will be able to cope with them. I will personally be ensuring that no underage student hoodwinks our impartial judge into making them Hogwarts champion. His light blue eyes twinkled as they flickered over Fred and George's mutinous faces. I therefore beg you not to waste your time submitting yourself if you are under 17. The delegations from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang will be arriving in October and remaining with us for the greater part of this year. I know you will all extend every courtesy to our foreign guests while they are with us, and will give your wholehearted support to the Hogwarts champion when he or she is selected. And now it is late, and I know how important it is to you all to be alert and rested as you enter your lessons tomorrow morning. Bedtime. Chop, chop. Dumbledore sat down again and turned to Mad-Eye Moody. There was a great scraping and banging as all the students got to their feet and swarmed toward the double doors into the entrance hall. And then Katie talks about either twins. Interesting. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that one. I love how Hermione seems to be the only one concerned by this tournament. She's the outlier in a lot of wizarding things that people take for granted, like house elves and omens. Why? I'm not, that's a rhetorical question, but why do we think that might be true? She's probably not the only muggle born, but she is definitely the only one that we've seen who attempts to control her anxiety like we have been shown she tries to do. Anxiety is definitely a core mover for Hermione. So when we see descriptions of her anxiety coming up, like we did in that scene where she hears about the risks, we know that she's going to react a little differently than everybody else. All right. And Katie calls out the muggle perspective. I'm not disagreeing. I think it's more than that, though. And back to the book. They can't do that, said George Weasley, who had not joined the crowd moving towards the door, but was standing up and glaring at Dumbledore. We're 17 in April. Why can't we have a shot? They're not stopping me entering, said Fred stubbornly, also scowling at the top table. The champions get to do all sorts of stuff you'd never be allowed to do normally. And 1,000 galleons prize money? Yeah, said Ron, a faraway look on his face. Yeah, 1,000 galleons. Come on, said Hermione. We'll be the only ones left here if you don't move. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Fred, and George sat off for the entrance hall. Fred and George debating the ways in which Dumbledore might stop those who were under 17 entering the tournament. Who's this impartial judge who's going to decide who the champions are? Said Harry. Don't know, said Fred, but it's them we'll have to fool. I reckon a couple of drops of aging potion might do it, George. Dumbledore knows you're not of age, though, said Ron. Yeah, but he's not the one who decides who the champion is he? Said Fred shrewdly. Sounds to me like once this judge knows who wants to enter, he'll choose the best from each school and never mind how old they are. Dumbledore's trying to stop us giving our names. People have died, though, said Hermione in a worried voice, as they walked through a door concealed behind a tapestry and started up another narrower staircase. Yeah, said Fred airily, but that was years ago, wasn't it? Anyway, where's the fun without a bit of risk? Hey, Ron, what if we find out how to get around Dumbledore? Fancy entering? What do you reckon? Ron asked Harry. Be cool to enter, wouldn't it? But I suppose they might want someone older. Don't know if we've learned enough. I definitely haven't, came Neville's gloomy voice from behind Fred and George. I expect my grand want me to try, though. She's always going on about how I should be upholding the family honor. I'll just have to. Oops. Neville's foot had sunk right through a step halfway up the staircase. There are many of these trick stairs at Hogwarts. It was second nature to most of the older students to jump this particular step, but Neville's memory was notoriously poor. Harry and Ron seized him under the armpits and pulled him out, while a suit of armor at the top of the stairs creaked and clanked, laughing wheezily. Shut it, you, said Ron, banging down its visor as they passed. And we're on the last page, and I'd like to posit a hypothesis here that what just happened to Neville, and I'm going to reread his sentence there. I expect my grand want me to try, though. She's always going on about how I should be upholding the family honor. I'll just have to. Oops. Now let's take this over by example to Friends. If you've seen Friends and you know Ross's character, when he is grounded and stable, he's not actually all that clumsy. But when something comes up that brings his anxiety up, his clumsiness manifests. And in this one sentence, he shares he feels pressured. There are expectations. And Grandma keeps talking about the family honor to Neville because she is telling him that he is not meeting it. And of course his anxiety rises, and just like that, he has an accident. Anyways, we're on the last page if I hadn't said that already. They made their way up to the entrance to Gryffindor Tower, which was concealed by a large portrait of a fat lady in a pink silk dress. Password, she said as they approached. Balderdash, said George. A prefect downstairs told me. The portrait swung forwards to reveal a hole in the wall through which they all climbed. A crackling fire was warming the circular common room, which was full of squashy armchairs and tables. Hermione cast the merrily dancing flames a dark look, and Harry distinctly heard her mutter, "Slave labor," before bidding them good night and disappearing through the doorway into the girls' dormitories. Harry, Ron, and Neville climbed up the last spiral staircase until they reached their own dormitory, which was situated at the top of the tower. 5 four-poster beds with deep crimson hangings stood against the walls, each with its owner's trunk at the foot. Dean and Seamus were already getting into bed. Seamus had pinned his Ireland rosette to his headboard, and Dean had tacked up a poster of Victor Crumb over his bedside table. His old poster of West Ham football team was pinned right next to it. I don't know anything about football, but I do know that West Ham is mentioned in Ted Lasso. Good show. Mental, Ron sighed, shaking his head at the completely stationary soccer players. Harry, Ron, and Neville got into their pajamas and into bed. Someone, a house elf no doubt, had placed warming pans between the sheets. It was extremely comfortable laying there in bed and listening to the storm raging outside. I might go in for it, you know, Ron said sleepily through the darkness. If Fred and George find out how to. The tournament. You never know, do you? Suppose not. Harry rolled over in bed, a series of dazzling new pictures forming in his mind's eye. He had hoodwinked the impartial judge into believing he was 17. He had become Hogwarts champion. He was standing in the grounds, his arms raised in triumph in front of the whole school, all of whom were applauding and screaming. He had just won the Triwizard tournament. Cho's face stood out particularly clearly in the blurred crowd, her face glowing with admiration. Harry grinned into his pillow, exceptionally glad that Ron couldn't see what he could. And thus ends chapter 12. I'm going to check the comments. We'll wrap up the chapter, and I'll throw out some comments for the channel in general, and we'll be done. I think I might be getting what you're trying to put down here. By Muggle perspective, you sort of actually mean like a modern perspective. Like Hermione knows this is wrong because we've had these discussions in the real world, and the fictional world that she, or not fictional, the isolated subculture of the wizarding world in which she is joining, those conversations have not happened. Because I think that's sort of what you're saying. Yes, and we're definitely not going to dismiss the anxiety piece. Absolutely. Ron is part and parcel of this culture, and he doesn't question any of the fundamental assumptions of his world. I know, right? Poor Neville. No, I would argue that the pressure put on Neville by his family is probably not only destroying his confidence, but it shows up as a lack of competence. Some portion of why Neville seems to be a failure is because his family has pressured him into being that way, in my opinion. It was a good chapter. It sure is hard to fully explain. So let's do the chapter recap. So what we had that I saw happen in this chapter is soon as we get on the grounds, we are in the entryway. We are assaulted by Peeves, who is chaos. He's brought to order by McGonagall, who is order. But there's no empathy in the process. The kids are yeeted in the room. We have our ceremony. We have a new Creevy. He seems annoying. Harry wanted to sit with Cho because She looks all Ravenclaw-y or whatever's happening there. We meet Mad Eye Moody. He seems very scary and unconcerned about being stared at and judged by everybody in the room. And then we have a Triwizard tournament. Let's look at this Triwizard tournament. It was canceled hundreds of years ago because there were too many deaths. And every now and then, somebody tries to bring it back, and there are too many deaths. And these people are trying to bring it back for the first time, and they think they've made it safe. Does that sound like dangerous hubris to you? It sounds like dangerous hubris to me. If it's been tried and failed and nobody's ever seen it in operation, and you don't remember how it was done and what the problems were, how can you be sure that you've fixed it? You're just making the same mistake in a different flavor. So this is already a bad idea. And we get the impression from the Weasleys that people pay to send their kids to these schools. What kind of education are these schools providing the students with half the faculty, the visiting schools, with half the faculty at Hogwarts for most of the school year? They didn't bring the whole school. Who are the kids that they left behind getting their classes from? Who are the kids that went to Hogwarts? Where are they getting their classes from? This sounds like a disservice to the students. I mean, it's all very exciting and all that, but possibly fatal. I haven't heard of any consequences that actually matter besides some cash. And it's bad learning, I would imagine. Oh, yeah. And now we've got a situation set up where there's going to be all kinds of jealousy and bitterness and resentment, and people will wish it was them. Now we've got 2 Creevies, and I don't even know about the second guy, but they sound intense. And we've got Mad Eye. It's a pretty interesting setup going into the rest of the book. Well, in other channel news, and I'll keep this brief. 1, I'd like to know if you guys like how the cameras are set up today. And 2, having caught up on the remasters, I'll be remastering this episode in like a day or 2. I'm going to start putting out what I'm going to call the commentary cuts, where I go back through the remasters and I take out most of the text that is not necessary to support my comments that I made at the time. And then once I get caught up there, so it'll basically be like, I don't know, 5 to 20 minute videos, which is mostly just my commentary. And the idea is once I'm done with that pass, I'm going to go back through and do full-on chapter level analyses, which will build together to book level analysis and chapter level analysis. So how this is going to progress is these series of videos is eventually going to become higher level analysis using these as the sort of initial seeds, and you can watch the evolution of the thought process. I'll give comments one more pass and call it a day. With as many barriers as Neville has, anything that causes him any friction is going to be a problem. And there's so many things. And that was Becca. And then Katie replies that, yes, the wand has a part to play too. That makes sense, actually. I like that idea a lot, Katie. Katie says, I think the reason Dumbledore agrees to the tournament is to bring in more allies for the war. That is an excellent idea. But let's zoom out a little bit further. What if it's not about allies for the war? If Dumbledore believes that the war is coming, what would be more important for all the student bodies? Studying your regular classes, or having this friction and competition and competitive drive and this chaos? The Triwizard tournament is better training for war than regular classes. Even if most of the student body don't get to do much, some part of conflict is about the spirit. So excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. A vote for the camera setup. Thank you. Witnesses. Can you say a bit more, Bex? I'm not really sure what you mean. It's also to prevent so much divide between differences. You mean like the differences between the schools or the nations? That one's not really clear to me either. I'll give you guys a moment if you want to chime in anything else, and I'll just sip some coffee. All right. Well, I really enjoyed this read, and I hope everybody else out there did too. Thank you, everybody, for joining me, and I hope you'll see me again too. And I am trying / planning to go to 2 lives a week, probably one on the weekend and one midweek somewhere. Ideally, the new cycle should be 2 lives, 2 remasters, and a couple of shorts. Most weeks. To bring more people together who are different, you know. Witnesses. Oh, I gotcha. If there's safety in numbers, it's better to have more diverse witnesses. Have staff and students from other schools. So it's not just a one school phenomenon. There's multiple sources for reporting. I like that thinking. All right, guys, I'm out. You have a lovely day. Be safe. Read happy. Bye, guys.